Hello and welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be taking a look at the Georgia runoff elections, which are occurring 8 days from now on December 6th, and looking at whether or not the Republicans could potentially flip this blue seat red after a pretty disastrous midterm overall. So we're going to take a look at some previous elections in Georgia. We'll take a look at some of the polling, although if you've watched my video on the midterm elections, polling really failed us this cycle. Nonetheless, we'll take a look to kind of see a partial gauge of where things might be going, and ultimately we'll take a look at Georgia's political transformation as a whole and whether or not it's realistic for Herschel Walker to have a chance in this runoff election. So we'll take a look at all of that in just a second, but first, if you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing down below and liking this video if you enjoy. Now, a lot of my videos going through the rest of the year will kind of be covering some of the trends and takeaways from the 2022 midterms, but really, the midterms aren't really over until we have the Georgia runoff. And again, I'll be live streaming next Tuesday night, kind of analyzing those results. So stay tuned for those. Georgia results tend to come in pretty quickly, so it won't be terribly long until we find out. If we take a look at the polls for the Georgia runoff, we've really only got one so far from Fabrizio Ward and Impact Research. I think a lot of pollsters are very nervous to poll Georgia, especially after the polling disaster that we had in 2022. And really the polling in 2022 was almost as bad as 2020. The only really difference was that in 2020, the polls still had Biden winning, even though they missed in a lot of the key swing states by several points, well outside of the margin of error. And this time around, the polls were so wrong that they got the wrong outcome. You know, polling indicated that Republicans were going to take the House and the Senate. They only took the House barely, and they actually lost ground in the Senate. And of course, if the Republican Party loses this Georgia runoff next week, they're going to be in even a worse position than they were before the midterms as far as the Senate is concerned. So we've only got one poll. Herschel Walker is down 51-47. Warnock has a sizable lead here, although it is within the margin of error. So of course, before we get into where I think the runoffs are actually going to go, let's take a look at some previous Georgia electoral history. And Georgia is one of the states that really has demographically and politically transformed over the past decade. 10 years ago, Georgia was a reliably Republican state. It wasn't voting for Republicans by safe margins, but this was a state that really wasn't that competitive. Republicans were always winning by high single digits, maybe even low double digits. You know, Romney won the state of Georgia by about 8 points back in 2012. Fast forward to 2016, Donald Trump won Georgia by about 5.1%. And then, of course, if we go to 2018, we see a much closer statewide race in Georgia for the governorship. Brian Kemp only beat Stacey Abrams by 1.4%. Now, relatively speaking, that's actually pretty good for the Republicans, especially considering the fact that in significantly redder states, Democrats did fairly well. But in Georgia, Republicans did hold their own, but it was a very close election by Georgia standards. Moving on to 2020, of course, Republicans lost Georgia for the first time since 1992 in a presidential election. Joe Biden beat Donald Trump in Georgia by 0.2%. And then, of course, we had the runoff elections where Democrats captured both of Georgia's Senate seats in one night. Of course, this midterm cycle, you have Raphael Warnock beating Herschel Walker by about 1 percentage point going into a runoff election. So Herschel Walker only getting 48.5% of the vote. For perspective, that's a smaller share of the vote than even Kelly Loeffler got in the runoff election when she lost by 2 points. At least she was able to get 49% of the vote. And of course, if we take a look at David Perdue's pre-runoff margin back in 2020, he got about 49.7% of the vote. It's not pulled up here, it's on the 2020 page, but he got about 49.7% of the vote, whereas you had Jon Ossoff only get 47.9. So David Perdue initially won this race by 1.8, but because Georgia has a runoff system, doesn't exactly mean he became senator, had to go to a runoff. He ultimately lost that runoff back in 2021, which gave control of the Senate to the Democrats, the 50-50 tie that we currently have. And then, of course, now we're looking at a situation where it's very likely that Herschel Walker is going to lose the runoff election. And the reason I say that is because he underperformed massively the rest of the Republican ticket. So Herschel Walker lost by about a point initially. If Georgia didn't have a runoff system, Herschel Walker would have lost outright. Warnock would have been reelected to another term. But if we take a look at the rest of the statewide ticket on the Republican side, the Republicans did fairly well in the state of Georgia. Brian Kemp won the governor's race by about 7.5%, which is a pretty large margin considering the fact that Georgia has very much been seen as a 50-50 state after the 2020 election. And really, Republicans haven't won any significant elections from 2020 until the midterms, where, of course, Brian Kemp and the rest of the statewide Republicans won. I mean, we could go down the list to the other statewide offices: lieutenant governor, attorney general, agricultural commissioner. All these other statewide offices went Republican, except the Senate race, in which you have Herschel Walker losing to Raphael Warnock. So there was a significant amount of split ticket voting. And if we take a look at some key counties in Georgia, the most populous and influential counties, politically speaking, are in the Atlanta metro area. Of course, if you take a look at Fulton County, Raphael Warnock beating Herschel Walker 74-25. That's even larger than his runoff election margin of victory, 72-27. So Herschel Walker did even worse in the Atlanta metro area than Donald Trump in 2020 and the runoff candidates in the 2021 election. So all across the board, Herschel Walker has shown himself to be a very weak candidate, especially now that the spotlight is on him. A lot of his verbal gaffes and his past have been really dug up again. And I think the reason Herschel Walker got as far as he did up to this point is because you had reluctant Kemp voters voting for Walker, because Kemp appeals to a demographic, independent conservatives that typically vote Republican but don't like Donald Trump. And some of them may have held their nose and voted for Walker, some of these Republicans, but I think a lot of Republicans are going to stay home during the runoffs, aren't really going to be energized to vote. Of course, as I talked about, some of those independents that are turned off by Herschel Walker's Trump affiliation, but I really think the bigger picture is that Republicans are fatigued from the midterms. They did very poorly, and ultimately Democrats win control of the Senate either way. The Republican base really isn't energized, and the Democratic voting base, which is much more of a high propensity voting base than the Republican base nowadays, more of a white collar, well-educated suburbanite base as opposed to a more rural, lower propensity base. And I think what you're going to see this time around is Democrats are going to be energized to vote for Raphael Warnock, and he's probably going to win by a bigger margin than expected. I think Warnock could win by as much as 5, maybe even 6 percentage points. Now, I think 6 is a bit on the high end, but considering some of the early vote numbers we've been seeing, and I'll talk maybe about more the early vote numbers as we get closer to the runoffs, but the first day of early voting, black turnout was incredibly high, and I think the enthusiasm for Warnock is going to be there. We saw a similar thing play out before Kemp's election, before the November elections, where you had black turnout much higher. Of course, it tapered off as early voting continued. Maybe we'll see the same thing, but the point is, black turnout was higher on the first day of early voting this time around than it was back in October, and that's certainly a very encouraging sign for the Democrats. Now, some of these key counties, again, we looked at Fulton County, Gwinnett and Cobb County. These are two counties that, again, just a decade ago were really likely red counties. These were counties that the GOP could always count on to win. This time around, that's really not the case. Again, if we take a look at Kemp's margins, Kemp did a lot better than Donald Trump 2020 in these counties. He got 44% in Gwinnett, 47% in Cobb. If we go back to the 2020 election, Donald Trump only got about 42% in Cobb, 40% in Gwinnett. So Kemp did significantly better than Donald Trump in the Atlanta metro, got 31% in Fulton County. Donald Trump was only able to get 26%. So Kemp has significant crossover appeal with right-leaning independents and even some Republicans that have sort of strayed away from Trump than Walker does. Again, we can take a look at Walker's numbers. Walker only got 40% in Cobb County. That's disastrous. Only got 39% in Gwinnett County. You cannot win statewide as a Republican with such poor numbers in Cobb and Gwinnett counties, because these are suburban counties that Republicans aren't going to win anymore, but they have to get within sort of a lean margin, sort of what Kemp did and even Raffensperger did in the Secretary of State race. You need to get these counties a lot closer if you want any hope at winning. We can even take a look at some of the exurban counties. Cherokee County, Herschel Walker only got 68% of the vote here. Chase Oliver, the Libertarian, surprisingly got 3% of the vote. And of course, you got Forsyth County, only 65% of the vote for Herschel Walker. In 2020, Donald Trump got about 65.8, 68% in Cherokee County. Walker is getting about 68, 65. So he's doing about the same as Donald Trump in the exurbs, but compared to Brian Kemp, who's getting 74% in Cherokee County, 72% in Forsyth, he's doing a lot worse. So Kemp is a much stronger candidate, and I think one of the reasons why Herschel Walker got this far is because Kemp was a good candidate. Herschel Walker is just a really poor candidate. I think this has less to do with the Trump endorsement in the runoff as it has to do with just Herschel Walker being an all-around bad candidate. He obviously doesn't know a lot about policy. He makes a ton of gaffes. There's a lot that Warnock could hit him on. Warnock has much more money than Herschel Walker does this time around. And that's one of the reasons why I think Herschel Walker is going to lose the runoff on December 6th. I think Raphael Warnock could win by as much as 5 to 6 percentage points. And especially given what we've seen in the midterm elections, the GOP does not have a reliable base anymore that turns out at the numbers that the Democratic base does. You know, one thing Donald Trump did since his inception in politics is really drive up Democratic turnout. And I think you're going to see that in these runoff elections. You know, had this been an isolated race with a generic R and a generic Democrat, the generic R probably would have won. But because the R, or the Republican, is Herschel Walker, he's probably going to lose. Warnock is a very strong incumbent, very charismatic, has a lot of appeal in these suburbs, as evidenced by the split ticket voting, the Kemp voters that voted for Warnock. And those same voters are likely to vote for him in the runoff again. And a lot of Republicans that may have voted for Kemp, maybe voted for Chase Oliver, or reluctantly voted for Walker, are going to stay home during the runoffs because there's nothing really big at stake. Democrats control the Senate either way. It's not really a big motivator to the base that we lost, and, you know, this is to stave off an even worse loss. You know, Democrats are in a strong position. Let's expand our majority. They're going to have a lot more enthusiasm this time around. So ultimately, I think Herschel Walker is going to lose. I think Warnock is going to win. I think he could win by as much as 5 to 6 points effectively, because I wouldn't be very shocked if Herschel Walker only got maybe 47% of the vote. You know, if Warnock gets 53% of the vote, that's a 6-point margin of victory right there, because you've only got 2 candidates on the ballot. So while I don't think that's the most likely scenario, I do think Warnock is going to win this election, probably by a lean margin, even bordering on likely. And again, that might have been a bold prediction a month ago, but given how the midterms are gone, given how much Republicans have underperformed, and given some of the early vote numbers and fundraising, there's no indication that this cycle isn't going to continue into next week's runoff election. And again, a lot of my future videos are going to be talking about some of the key takeaways from 2022. Obviously, we've got a lot of 2024 news as well. You're starting to see this brewing feud between the DeSantis Republican wing and, of course, the Trump Republican wing. So we'll be talking about that. We'll be talking somewhat about Democratic primaries, but it really seems evident that Joe Biden is going to be the Democratic frontrunner as of right now. So there's really not a lot to talk about on the other end of things. But we'll talk about political trends in general. I've got a lot of videos lined up about some of the key takeaways from the midterms in some states, which states are trending right, which states are trending left, and ultimately how that ties into 2024. So if you're interested in that, please, again, if you haven't subscribed already, subscribe to the channel. Like this video down below if you enjoyed. As always, again, thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.